There is a certain kind of television star who burns so brightly in a single role that the rest of their life disappears behind it. Audiences see the character, not the man. They see the hat and the rifle and the frontier justice, and they assume that what they are watching on screen is more or less what the actor is like when the cameras go dark. Chuck Connors was exactly that kind of star. 4 or 5 seasons and 168 episodes. He played Lucas McCain in The Rifleman, a widowed father raising his son alone on the New Mexico frontier, tough enough to outgun any villain who rode into North Fork and tender enough to kneel beside his boy and talk through the difference between right and wrong. It was a performance that made him one of the most beloved figures in the history of American television. And it was a performance so convincing, so completely inhabited, that for decades it obscured everything behind it. Because behind Lucas McCain was Kevin Joseph Aloysius Connors, a Brooklyn-born son of Irish immigrants who had been a professional athlete in 2 different major American sports before he ever stood in front of a camera, who had carried private struggles and complicated relationships through a public life built on an image of rugged, wholesome dependability, and who had, in one of the stranger footnotes of Cold War history, become a beloved celebrity in the Soviet Union at a moment when American and Soviet tensions were among the highest they had ever been. The man behind The Rifleman was larger, messier, and considerably more fascinating than the character he played. And now, more than 30 years after his death, enough has emerged to finally see him whole. The beginning of his story was genuinely humble in the way that post-immigrant working-class Brooklyn stories tend to be. His parents had come over from Newfoundland and built a life in the Bay Ridge neighborhood through sheer determination, his father working the docks as a longshoreman, and his mother taking in whatever additional work she could find during the long, grinding years of the Depression. Chuck, still known as Kevin in those days, spent his time at the Bay Ridge Boys Club, playing sports with an intensity and a natural talent that was impossible to miss. He served as an altar boy at Our Lady of Perpetual Help and went to school there before his athletic gifts earned him a scholarship to Adelphi Academy, a private high school in Brooklyn. The scholarship was a significant development for a kid from a working-class household, and he didn't waste it. At Adelphi, he excelled in baseball, basketball, football, and track, establishing himself as the kind of multisport talent that only comes along every so often. He got his nickname during his college years at Seton Hall University, where he had chosen to play both baseball and basketball after receiving scholarship offers from more than 24 institutions. As a first baseman on the baseball team, he had a habit of calling out to his pitcher with the same enthusiastic phrase, telling the pitcher to chuck it to him. His teammates started calling him Chuck, and it stuck permanently. He never really looked back at Kevin after that. What also stuck during his college years was a passion for dramatic poetry recitation that sounds like an unusual hobby for an athlete, but turned out to be a significant clue about where his life was heading. He learned pieces like Casey at the Bat and performed them for anyone who would listen with enough theatrical commitment that baseball legend Ted Williams, who heard him perform once, laughingly told him he should give up sports and become an actor. Connors laughed it off. Sports were his plan. Then the war interrupted everything. He enlisted in the Army and was stationed at Fort Knox because of his height and athletic ability, training as a tank warfare instructor. He later moved to West Point, where he worked with soldiers and found ways to stay connected to sports even in uniform. By the time he was honorably discharged, he had played semi-professional baseball during his free time and had also played professional basketball in the American Basketball League. His energy was relentless, and his appetite for competition in any form was essentially insatiable. After leaving the Army, he signed with the newly formed Boston Celtics, becoming part of their very first season and standing out not only for his play, but for his personality. The team frequently sent him to represent them as an after-dinner speaker because he was so naturally charismatic and entertaining in front of a crowd. Those recitations he had practiced at Seton Hall served him well. He would perform poems and keep audiences genuinely engaged, and the skill of holding a room's attention through performance was one he would soon discover had professional applications he hadn't anticipated. He played in 49 games that first season before leaving to pursue his true first love, which was always baseball. His baseball career was marked by persistence more than sustained success. He eventually got his chance with the Brooklyn Dodgers, the team he had dreamed of playing for since childhood, but the moment was brief. He appeared in one game, hit into a double play, and the team lost. He was sent back to the minor leagues. He kept going, moving through various teams until he landed with the Chicago Cubs in the major leagues for a season, hitting his first home run against the New York Giants and eventually compiling 48 hits with the respectable batting average for someone splitting his athletic ambitions between two professional sports. Then the Los Angeles Angels of the minor leagues came calling and Connors headed west, which turned out to be the decision that changed everything. During a game for the Angels against the Sacramento Solons, Connors hit a home run that caught the attention of a man sitting in the crowd named Billy Gordon, a casting director for MGM. Gordon came to the locker room after the game, handed Connors his card, and suggested he think about acting. Connors didn't take it seriously at first. He was a baseball player. He had been an athlete his entire adult life, and that was how he understood himself. But a few weeks later he injured himself during a game and found himself with unexpected time on his hands. Out of curiosity more than anything else, he went to MGM. They offered him a screen test on the spot. He did it. They liked what they saw. 3 days later he had signed his first Hollywood contract. His first role was a small one in a romantic comedy called Pat and Mike, starring Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. Connors played a police captain and appeared only briefly, but the experience was formative. He arrived early on his first day and spent hours in preparation for a scene that didn't shoot until late that night. When the cameras finally rolled, he delivered in 2 takes. Spencer Tracy pulled him aside afterward and told him he had something and that he should stick with it. Coming from one of the most respected actors in Hollywood, those words landed hard. Connors took them seriously and threw himself into building an acting career with the same intensity he had always brought to everything else. Over the next several years, he accumulated screen time across more than 20 films and 18 television shows, building his technique and his reputation simultaneously. He played alongside Gregory Peck and Charlton Heston in The Big Country. He appeared in Disney's Old Yeller as Bern Sanderson, a performance that helped him get noticed by a much wider audience. He made himself available for everything, learning from every set and every co-star he worked with. The industry started to take note of this tall, rugged, blue-eyed man with the distinctive jaw and the booming voice. And then the Rifleman came calling. He initially said no. The pay was less than what he was earning elsewhere, and he didn't see why he should take a step backward financially. The producers wanted him badly enough to negotiate, however, and they eventually offered him not just better money, but a 5% ownership stake in the show itself. That changed the calculation entirely. He accepted and then prepared for the role with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. He worked with a gun expert named Rod Redwing to master the handling of the modified Winchester that would become the show's most recognizable visual element. The lever had been made extra large to allow for a spectacular spinning technique, and the trigger had been modified to allow for rapid fire. Connors practiced the spin and draw sequences until his hands were blistered, refusing to stop until the movement was automatic and looked completely effortless on camera. The show premiered in the fall of, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Over 14 million viewers watched the first episode, and the ratings stayed strong throughout the show's run. What audiences responded to wasn't just the action, though the action was genuinely exciting. They responded to the emotional core of the show, which was the relationship between Lucas McCain and his young son Mark, played by Johnny Crawford. Lucas was a widower doing his best to raise a boy alone in a rough country, and the show explored that dynamic with unusual honesty for the era. It showed a single father struggling with real questions about when to protect and when to let go, when to be strong and when to admit difficulty. Single fathers across America wrote letters to Connors, describing how the show had affected them personally, how seeing Lucas McCain on screen made them feel less alone in their own struggles. Connors was not a passive participant in the show's creative life. By the second season, he was attending writers' meetings and pitching story ideas. He fought for storylines that showed his character's flaws and moral complexity, including an episode where Lucas accidentally kills an innocent man, a storyline Connors pushed for because he felt it was important to show the genuine weight of carrying a weapon. He rewrote dialogue to make it sound more authentically like a working rancher from that period. He brought in guest stars, including former baseball teammates. He co-wrote the two-part series finale. By the end of the show's run, he was credited as a story consultant on several episodes, a level of creative involvement that was unusual for actors in that era of television. The show ran for 5 seasons and left a cultural mark that has never fully faded. Merchandise generated millions of dollars. The show earned Emmy nominations. Reruns have continued to find audiences for decades, and surveys of older television viewers consistently identify The Rifleman as one of the most beloved shows in the history of the medium. Connors had created something genuinely lasting, and yet when the show ended, he found himself in the trap that has caught many beloved television actors. He was Lucas McCain. No matter what else he tried to do, that was who people saw when they looked at him. He turned down 8 Western television pilots in the years immediately after the show ended, determined not to simply replicate what he had already done. He tried romantic comedy in a film alongside Doris Day and James Garner that didn't quite work for him. He played a defense attorney in a television series called Arrest and Trial that critics appreciated, but which was canceled after a single season. He returned to Westerns with Branded, in which he played a cavalry officer falsely accused of cowardice, who was spending his life trying to clear his name, a character with considerably more interior complexity than Lucas McCain. The show gave him room to show a different kind of performance, and it ran for 2 seasons. But the role that surprised nearly everyone who knew his work came in when he was cast as Tom Moore, a brutal plantation slave owner in the landmark miniseries Roots. The production was built around the history of an African-American family, from slavery through the generations to modern times, and it was one of the most ambitious and culturally significant television events ever attempted. Connors disappeared entirely into the cruelty of his character, delivering a performance that showed none of Lucas McCain's warmth or moral clarity. The final episode of Roots was watched by roughly 100 million viewers, making it one of the most-watched broadcasts in American television history. Connors received an Emmy nomination for his work in it, a recognition that acknowledged what the performance was, a genuine actor doing something completely unexpected and pulling it off. His personal life, however, was considerably more turbulent than his professional image suggested. He was married 3 times, and by his own admission, his intense focus on his career made him consistently neglect his relationships. His first marriage, to Elizabeth Jane Riddell, whom he had met in Montreal while playing minor league baseball, produced 4 sons and lasted more than a decade before ending in the early. The marriage had been strained by long absences, by rumors of infidelity that followed him through the peak years of his fame, and by the fundamental difficulty of building a home life with someone whose attention was always being pulled toward the next role, the next shoot, the next professional ambition. He and Elizabeth eventually divorced, and he admitted years later that his career had crowded out the things that should have mattered more. His second marriage was to Kamala Devi, an actress of Indian and British descent whom he met while filming the movie Geronimo. Their relationship was unusual for Hollywood at a time when interracial couples were still relatively uncommon in public life, and they worked together on several projects, including his television series Branded. Kamala pushed him toward more sophisticated material and more complex roles, while Connors remained attached to the rugged image that had made him famous. The tension between their different visions for his career, combined with his established pattern of emotional unavailability, eventually ended the marriage after nearly a decade together. His third marriage was his shortest and perhaps his most controversial. He met Faith Quabius on the set of Soylent Green, where she had a small role, and the relationship that developed between them had a significant age gap that raised eyebrows even in an industry accustomed to unconventional pairings. They married in a private ceremony in Mexico when Connors was in his mid-50s, and the marriage lasted only a couple of years before ending in divorce. Faith later made allegations of abusive behavior during the marriage that damaged his public reputation, though Connors denied the claims. He never spoke extensively about any of his marriages in public, other than to acknowledge that his career had always been his primary relationship and that the people who loved him had suffered for it. Then there's the chapter of his life that belongs entirely to the strange theater of Cold War politics, and that reads like something out of a novel. The Rifleman had been broadcast in the Soviet Union, one of the very few American television programs permitted on Soviet television during the long years of tension between the two nations. The show's themes: a strong father figure, frontier justice, moral clarity, family loyalty, resonated with Soviet audiences in ways that nobody in Hollywood had anticipated. By the early, an estimated 250 million Soviet citizens were familiar with Lucas McCain. That audience included, most notably, Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, who was not merely a casual viewer, but a devoted fan. When Brezhnev visited Washington for the summit with President Nixon, the White House was well aware of this connection. Press Secretary Ron Ziegler pulled Connors aside and told him directly that Brezhnev was a fan and suggested he find an opportunity to do something memorable when they met. What happened at the reception that followed has become one of the genuinely delightful anecdotes of that entire Cold War period. Brezhnev, the leader of the world's other nuclear superpower, who commanded an arsenal capable of ending civilization, ran across the room and wrapped his arms around Chuck Connors in a bear hug, lifting the actor off the ground. Connors, standing 6'5" and built like a former professional athlete, was lifted by the Soviet leader. It was one of those moments that cuts through ideology entirely and reveals the human being underneath the statesman. Connors presented Brezhnev with a pair of engraved Colt revolvers, a gift he had ordered specifically because he knew of the Soviet leader's passion for firearms. Connors had told people in his circle that Brezhnev was going to get more than a tie clip, which was the standard token gift being passed around at Nixon's instructions. Brezhnev was reportedly delighted by the weapons, which was entirely in character for a man known to maintain his own collection of guns and fast cars at his private residence. The encounter between the Brooklyn-born cowboy actor and the Soviet General Secretary was brief, but it was warm and it was genuine, and it generated photographs that captured something that no formal diplomatic communique could have expressed about what popular culture could do across the most heavily fortified ideological border in human history. In the final years of his life, Connors continued working steadily even as his health began to decline. He appeared in horror films and science fiction productions. He took guest roles on popular television shows. He played a villain in a werewolf-themed series with a commitment he described as wanting to be the Lon Chaney of the